In the early 1940s, the free shows were on the north end of the west side of the street. The shows stopped when people got TVs in the early 1950s. The nights of the free shows were called open nights, and the stores were busy. Bill built the new grocery store in 1975. It will be closed September 1st unless a buyer is found. Many people buy their groceries in Lincoln. This used to be where the Palmyra peddler, Leslie Smith, stored his inventory. Before that, it was Dick White's Grocery and Wilhelm's Redbird Grocery, and formerly belonged to Fred Haley's. The Oddfellows Hall was above the store and had an outside entrance. Before 1914, it was J.R. McKees Grocery. At one time, a fire destroyed most of this east side of the street from Wilhelm's to the corner. Barns also burned. Barbara McCary bought it this year and had it demolished and was named Palmyra Citizen of the Year for her efforts to improve the community. Steinoff restored the 1890s hotel on the south corner for her boutique, and it is now the home of Barbara McCary. In the 1940s and 50s, Ralph Roach had a drugstore here with a soda fountain, and there were living quarters above. It was also the bus stop. Later, it was run by Denver McPherson. It sat empty for a time until Becky's restoration. Bob Fey copied the porch trim for her. In the distant past, the cars parked in the middle of the street. Before that, there were boardwalks 4 feet above ground that preceded sidewalks. They went from the park by way of the Olson House, Sweet House, and the depot. Drugstore. There was a small jail that stood unused as late as the 1940s and 50s. It originally was a public restroom and shelter built by Mayor Dick Nash in 1930. Block east of Becky's, or the drugstore, was a 2-story hotel, the Palmyra House. Family-style meals were served there in the 1920s. It was the home of the Emil Lemon family in the 1940s. It was torn down and the Pat Smiths built a small house on the property in the 1960s. I have a picture of the Palmyra House from the south as I lived across the street. These 2 blocks from the bank to the lumberyard made a good sledding hill. To the corner east, where Leslie Smith now lives, was the home of Ed Pump, who had a shoe repair shop in a building just north of the house. That building still stands. The lumberyard was across the street east and was owned and operated by Moore and then Eggleston and by John Mahoney, a real lumberman, in the 1940s and 50s. Ross McCormick of Unadilla bought it, and Herman Lutschemeyer worked for him in the 1960s. In the early 1900s, north and east of the lumberyard was the stockyards run by the Francis family. Wood and livestock corral pens were built next to the railroads in several of the small towns. Frank Francis was a livestock buyer in Palmyra. On Sunday afternoons, farmers and their neighbors with cattle to sell would get together and drive cattle to the railroad corral pens. Frank would then buy the cattle. Wagons with high sideboards were used to haul hogs to the livestock pens for sale. The livestock would be loaded on so-called cattle cars and sent to Nebraska City. From there, the cars would be switched to a train going to Omaha. The livestock would then arrive for the early Monday morning market. They shipped on the nearby Burlington and Missouri River Railroad, loaded at night when it was cooler. Pearl Stilwell's twin Earl, Francis, was thrown from his horse and killed while working at the stockyards. This area is now used by the co-op. People rode the train to Lincoln. A daily round trip was available from Lincoln to Nebraska City. Passengers could board the train at the various towns. The mail and freight merchandise arrived in Palmyra by train. Mr. Balfour ran the local dray, which consisted of a team of horses and a special wagon. He would bring the mail to the post office and distribute the freight to the various businesses. He also hauled coal to the homes. Farmers would bring their 10-gallon cans of cream to the railroad depot. The cans would be shipped to a creamery in Iowa. The farmers were paid after the cream reached its destination. Water towers were next to the depot to supply water to the steam locomotive as was needed. Palmyra sign was the location of the depot, built in 1870. Part of it is now at the Bob Fey farm. Built in 1879 and 1838. The elevator had the first radio in town in 1922 to get the market. The co-op added the big elevators for grain storage in the 1950s and added the present building or office. Dated 1913, and this one built in 1962. Occupies the location of Mr. Waite's Hardware and later a hardware store owned by Chris and Marie Olson, starting in 1910. Noel and Jean Golden owned it in 1961, when it plus two adjoining buildings burned. Next door was Tom Bell's building with the Masonic Lodge Hall above at that time. The first floor was a men's clothing store. In the 1930s, Louis Krantz had a grocery in this building and went to farms to butcher and sold some of the meat. In 1945, the government standards required that meat to be sold had to come from a packing plant, so that practice ended. Wachtel's jewelry store later used this location. Tom Bell brought 100 people from England to Palmyra in 1867. He left England due to his health. It took 21 days' travel on the ocean. People came for land or homesteads. It took 5 years to gain title or prove up. The present Masonic Lodge Hall is the new post office built in 1988. Formerly, the post office had 3 locations on the west side of the street in the next block. Longtime postal workers were Mabel Foreman, Helen Morrill Surs, and Barb Fey. In earliest times, the stagecoach brought the mail to the McKee farm southwest of town. There were no bridges, so a person went down with a lantern where the creek was forded. There was a post office in a home in town and at the Centennial Hotel in 1876 and in Foster's store. In the old days, businesses extended the length of the 3rd block on both sides of the street. Poles for lights were sold in this location. They were kept in a cave. There were gas street lights. Clyde Tough Weight lived in a small building that was a harness shop, and fireworks were sold there in recent times. The next door south was Henry McCart's candy store. McCart, born in Palmyra in 1872. Richard Dick Oakley had the first business in Palmyra in 1869, a general store, continuing in the same building 45 years. Farmers could sell him chickens as well. A.R. Reitmeyer came to Palmyra when there were only 5 residences. Les Reitmeyer later had this building and had a thrashing machine business for wheat and oats, and also did repair work. Machinery was also sold. There are living quarters in the back. There were little pipes for gas lights, but they could explode.
Whoops.
There are homes between the stores. Flossie and Mark Kaiser lived on the south side of the tavern. I believe these buildings are now owned by Norma Speck. The original American Legion Hall was half a block south of the bank on the west side, and Boy Scout meetings were held there. There was no saloon in Palmyra for 60 years. Starting in the 1940s, the tavern or beer joint was run by Scotts, Hulls, and Schlechtas, and was named the 5th Quarter by Carl Ashmans, who sold it in 1992. Friday night fish fries were popular. The Carl Josephsons own it now. Formerly, this big building was Sam Rudge's harness shop. Floyd and Dorothy Palmer had a creamery in this area in connection with Beatrice Creamery and moved their business to Unadilla in the 1940s. Before that, Bill Wheeler ran the cream station, making 3 in town at one time. The Bank of Palmyra had its centennial in 1990. It was started by the Catrins of Nebraska City. Castles was the banker in 1910. C.A. Sweet Sr., an attorney who became a lawyer the hard way by working as an apprentice in Milford, New York, practiced law in Odo County, and was manager and an officer at the bank 66 years, 1883 through 1948, when he was 93. There was formerly another bank in North Palmyra. Douglas bought the bank, and Joe Dowding was manager in the 1970s, and Dave Hall has been the banker since 1980. It is also an insurance agency. The bank is now known as the Farmers and Merchants Bank. A house was attached to the south side of the bank and has recently been removed. Crances, Charlotte Robertson, a teacher, and Doris Luff lived there. You can see there also is another home or building to the south of the bank. Dr. William Cameron lived and had his office a block west of the bank until 1910. Dr. Will Charlton, who died at age 34, and then Dr. C.P. Percy Charlton, was the doctor from 1914 until his death in 1942 at age 55. A third brother also was a doctor. It is presently the home of Edith Roberts and Jimmy Kohler. Across the street north from the bank, approximately the south half of the west side of the street was destroyed by fire long ago. They were 2 stories, so the owners could live above the stores. Lodge halls also were above stores. The new buildings were finished with brick fronts. Cardan is a sheet metal business and heating and air conditioning. It was started by Carl Josephson and Dan Andrzejewski. It formerly was the Palmyra Auto Company, where my family bought new cars and had them repaired. C.A. Sweet started it in 1912 and owned it until Joe Dowding bought it and operated it 1955 through 1967. Tina Hessen and Glenn Cressley, who later moved to Douglas, were mechanics and trained young men of the community. North was Ralph Roach's drugstore with poker in the back. Later it has been cafes owned by Vern Dowding, Mary Dowding, Ener Thompsons, and Comptons. The north half was a post office for 30 years, 1950 through the 1980s. The 1940s post office was small, possibly dating back to 1917. In this same area was a variety store, and Walter Barnes had a grocery. Dick Oakley's had a nice clothing store on this block at one time. Kenneth and Paul Oakley had a ready-to-wear store, 1915 through 33. Sherry Eikenberry Moss, and now Jill Stephen, has a beauty shop, and there is adjoining office space where Guy Wemple had a furniture store and funeral home until the 1960s. He purchased the business from Billy Vaughn in 1931. Roger Smith opened a drafting and appraisal office this year. Pearl and Louis Spark Krantz bought Mike Young's grocery, which had a locker in 1948. People rented lockers because they did not have freezers as part of their refrigerators, or they were big enough only for ice cube trays and ice cream. Farmers butchered their own meat and needed a place to keep it. Krantz had Palmyra groceries during 4 decades and retired in 1969. Half of today's activity center was formerly a hardware and later the Nash Theater, 1911 through 1930. Nash Theater had silent picture shows and was the town hall for dances and school basketball and plays. That building was a large cafe in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. DeMoss, Burton's, Molman's, Hull's, and Ferguson's ran it. It was used for a Lions Club and then torn down to make way for the Activities Center, built in 1983. Part of the upper trim was kept. The town clerk's office also is in this building. A noon meal is served weekdays, and there is entertainment and games. The building can be rented for special occasions. Formerly, Gerstenschlager's Body Shop was the location of Tom Nash's restaurant and Brown's Barber Shop. Today it is used by mechanics. It was a large telephone building that included living quarters. Irene Dowding had a beauty shop in the south half before building one in her home, and later it was the barber shop of Carrie Stocking. There were wide concrete steps in the front, and people would sit there to visit. In 1901, there were switchboard operators we called Central. My number was 1203, which meant 3 short rings. This was a party line, and neighbors on the same line heard those rings and could listen in. The dial system started in 1962. Telephone operators were Hilda Burton, Ora Graves, Dorothy Lucas Palmer, Lily Frances Beecham, Pearl Frances Stilwell, Esther Guy, Zelma Gage, Eva Lanning, Mae Thompson, Rachel Nash, Wyman Wiles, Beulah Anderson, Ruth Baker, and the Moothearts. They wore headsets, and what they spoke into was worn around their neck and resembled a horn. Where the present small telephone building was formerly the Bruce Winkleplex store, and later Billy Vaughn's furniture store and mortuary. It was a vacant lot in the 1940s, and free picture shows were held here before the location near Bill's store. The first fire equipment was kept in a cave, we think, in this location. There was a building on top of the cave which was used to keep the ladders and fire equipment. The fire tank wagon contained chemicals and had to be kept in the cave to prevent freezing. The concrete ramp, which was used to get the tank out of the cave, had impressions for men to place their feet for leverage. This brick garage was an old firehouse. Oh, but I'm too far from you, Minnie. The fountain was on the north corner. People could get a drink, and the lower tank was for the horses at this spot. The fountain was on the north corner. People could get a drink, and the lower tank was for the horses. There were earlier libraries in other locations that burned. They were in the basement of the town hall and above the drugstore. The Women's Club worked for the current building on Illinois Avenue that opened in 1920. Mrs. Merwin, Lily Frances Beecham, and Dorothy Seaman Dwinell have been longtime librarians. The street north of the library was the home of Chris and Marie Olson, who ran the hardware store where the present Lodge Hall is located. Their son Leland graduated from Palmyra with the class of 1938. He and his cousin Frank Olson Jr. wrote a short history of Palmyra that appeared in the school High Times and the Palmyra Items when they were high school students. It was based on interviews with Mr. and Mrs. Guy McKee, Mrs. Merwin, and George Weatherhog. In 1993, it was announced that Dr. Leland and Dorothy Olson had pledged nearly $5.4 million to establish a center for women's health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center at Omaha. Investments with Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway made this possible. Leland is a retired Omaha obstetrician. Dick and Bella Nash lived 1 block west of the present telephone building. He was a builder and built District 8, where Craig and Pam Bolts and family live now. He also built a Christian church in Unadilla, besides homes, and so forth. His son Clinton, in the home next door, continued the construction business. Dick lived to be over 100 years old and died in 1994. Clinton now has a new home near the highway. In the late 1870s, there were 3 general stores, 2 hardwares, 2 drugstores, 2 doctors, 2 millinery or hat shops, 2 groceries, a dressmaking shop, 2 lumber yards, a flour mill, 3 blacksmiths, a livery or horse barn, 2 barbers, 2 shoe shops, a harness shop, a newspaper, implement store, and cheese factory south of town. In 1890, machinery from the knitting factory was moved to Syracuse. In 1932, Roy Thompson and his father, Charlie, or C.A. Thompson, had a trucking business and sold A&G oil and case tractors. After Roy and Laura were married in 1940, pumps were installed at the home of Charlie and Ruth Thompson, across the street northeast of the present location, using bronze and ethyl gasoline. Laura's 3 children, Larry, David, and Linda, have helped in the business through the years. Above and underground tanks were put in. present location about 1959. Laura tended the station and did the bookwork while Roy ran the tank wagon and farmed and took care of livestock. Following Laura's death in 1993 and Roy's in 1998, their daughter Linda and husband Jim Young bought the business at a public auction and reopened in March 2000. Was a part of the farm with Sally Mahoney and will help you locate where the present sale barn is. The Southeast Nebraska Livestock Market was built in 1979 by Dale and Becky Steinoff and opened for business in 1980, 20 years ago. Sheep and goats are sold on Mondays. Wednesday sales are during the day during the winter and in the evening during the summer. That is when cattle, hogs, hay, garden produce, chickens, ducks, rabbits, and other small animals are sold. There were 300 rabbits for sale recently. In the spring and fall, there are specially scheduled horse and exotic animal sales. Exotic covers a wide variety, such as snakes, hedgehogs, buffalo, emus, and ostriches. A lunch bar is also available. Northern Natural Gas Company, 1 mile east and 2.5 miles north of Palmyra. Now an entity of Enron Corporation, has provided jobs and benefits for the community. The first engine was installed in 1931. At its peak, there were 75 to 80 employees because the pipeline crew came down from Lincoln. 24,000 horsepower of compression sends the gas down the line. There were 26 engines and 64 employees until 1985. Now there are only 14 employees at the booster plant, with 7 working on the pipeline and 7 taking care of the plant. My dad, Cecil Powers, and his brother Bill worked there over 30 years. Convenience store owned by the GMG Corporation, Gerald, Marjorie, and Glenn Royal, opened in 1994. Marjorie was Mrs. Orland Moss and died of cancer. The location of the business was planned to be ready for the 4-lane highway. There are credit card pumps for round-the-clock service. Trucks may park overnight. There is full hookup for overnight RV camping. There are 40 rental storage units. Chicken strips, hamburgers, hot dogs, pizza, and other foods are for sale, and there are tables for seating. Nebraska 2 is a shortcut connecting Interstates 80 and 29. The 56 miles from Nebraska City to Lincoln have taken 16 years and $95 million to become 4-lane. It should now be much safer and benefit the small towns along it because the commute time to Lincoln is shortened. The highway averages 1,250 trucks daily. Work was completed in July of 2000, this year. Acres were purchased in 1878 for Rosewood Cemetery. William Francis and Thomas Bell drove to the lowlands south of Nebraska City and brought back 300 native cedar trees. There are now over 1,500 marked graves and some unmarked. .5 acres were purchased from J.M. Taggart for the Catholic Cemetery in 1879. Transfers were made from the first Catholic cemetery 2 miles west and 1.5 miles south of Palmyra. This cemetery is a memorial to Father Cusson. The original crude fence burned, and James T. Mahoney put up a net wire fence. This is the end of our video, and we apologize for any errors, omissions, or misunderstandings. A lot has happened in 130 years. Thanks to all those who helped gather this information, and best wishes for Palmyra's future.